Hey everyone, and welcome to She Plays the Podcast. I am super excited today to be joined by Jenna Weiner, a transgender woman athlete who's on the board of the Western Ultimate League, also a lead education and training coordinator who works with LGBTQ youth. I'm super excited for this conversation. I feel like it's a much needed one that we have not had much on our podcast yet. So thank you so much, Jenna, for coming on.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I'd love to hear a little bit about you and your story, and then we can get into all that you do currently in sports and life. But yeah, just tell listeners a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, so as the intro said, I'm a trans woman athlete. I mostly focus on disc sports, so Ultimate Frisbee has been my main sport of choice for almost a decade now, although Ultimate Frisbee hasn't been able to happen since the pandemic started. So I've been playing quite a bit more disc golf, which I've also played for quite a long time, but I've only recently started getting into it a lot more. I've been playing sports all my life. Started with soccer growing up, ran cross country and track in high school, and then started playing ultimate more in college, which is where a lot of people tend to find ultimate. I started transitioning in 2016. That was after I had graduated undergrad and was preparing to go to graduate school, and realized I was trans about 2 weeks before I moved to Reno, Nevada, where I would do my graduate school. So that was a whole big
Wow.
shift
Yeah.
for me. Yeah. And yeah, from there, I transitioned, was figuring out what it was like to be a transgender athlete because I was still trying to play ultimate at that time. Um, and it kind of evolved from there. At one point, I wrote an article coming out to the Ultimate Frisbee community that I thought would be maybe read by 100 people. And then it was read by hundreds of people. And I realized, okay, maybe this is actually important to talk about the experiences that I had as a trans athlete, as a trans woman. And that basically launched everything to where I am today. I ended up kind of switching. I switched my career path basically 180 degrees. I started being a lot more involved in activism and speaking up and education, which has a few years later brought me to this point speaking with you.
Yeah, and we're so thankful and happy to be having this conversation. Yeah, I mean there's so much change I imagine that goes into that life transition, and I do want to dig into again like what it was like for you, but just curious about the what you've seen since. I feel like there are people that are becoming more comfortable sharing their journey or sharing their identity, but um yeah, has it been like did I feel like this is a question that should come later, but I mean, have you had people reaching out like, how did you do this? How should I do this? I mean, I'm just curious that once you see one, it's like, okay, I have permission now. Just kind of curious, did you
Yeah.
have that when you started your transition, and then since, what's it been like?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I'm going to mostly speak to Ultimate Frisbee because that's the community I've been most involved in. But in 2016, when I started to transition, there were a handful of out transgender people in Ultimate Frisbee. And of the people who were out, only one was even remotely visible and vocal, to my knowledge at that point. He lived in Australia. So it wasn't like there was anyone close to me in California to really connect with. Um, so yeah, it was kind of I would say a little bit lonely because I was just kind of like going at it alone at that point in Ultimate. There was like a little bit of conversation about trans athletes and a little bit of discussion, but there weren't very many people contributing their voices. And so part of the reason why I decided to come out and write an article um, coming out effectively to the Ultimate Frisbee community was, hey, here's my story, here's my voice, hopefully it'll be helpful. And it turned into a whole whole bigger thing than I thought it would be at that point. And in the years since, there have been more and more trans folks coming out in Ultimate, and in the sports world at large. Chris Mosher is a really big name in the transgender sports world. He's probably one of the names that comes to the forefront when people think about transgender sports at the moment. And he started transitioning, I want to say, or coming out publicly in 2015, 2016. His making of the US team sparked the change for the Olympics, for
Mm.
the IOC to change their policy in 2016. So I'd heard about that and seen that, but that wasn't necessarily the impetus for me to come out. It was that I want to share my story. And then since there have been um, newer trans folks, younger trans folks reaching out, is like, hey, I want to transition. Here's my story, and I've continued to talk with some of those folks in the years since, as they've come out and transitioned and started to share their own stories. So I've definitely really seen a sea change in Ultimate since I started coming out. Part of my coming out as well was related to policy because USA Ultimate, when I came out, had about a one-page transgender inclusion policy, which was based on the NCAA's, but wasn't very inclusive or comprehensive. And so part of my first article was basically trying to push USA Ultimate to be better and change their policy. And about a year and a half later, in November of 2018, they had updated a new policy that was much more comprehensive. And then just this year, um, just what, a month ago now, they released a brand new trans and non-binary inclusion policy that doesn't have any hormone requirements and is totally
Wow.
open for people to play as they want, which was largely the effort of trans and non-binary people in the community who have come out. I wouldn't say just solely in the past few years, but it's definitely going from a barely a page policy in 2017 to a fully no hormone requirements, fully inclusive of non-binary and transgender athletes in 2020, 2021 is incredible.
Yeah.
Uh, and I hope that the rest of the sports world can take notice that it is possible to make those changes and make sports welcoming in that way.
Yeah. So that brings up two different questions I want to go down. The first being that I do feel like Ultimate does lead the way here. I do feel like of all the leagues I've seen, they're the one that has women with the X, which I'm not sure if there's a pronunciation for that, but like the inclusive nature of cisgender, transgender women in the league. Why do you feel like that sport more than others has had the like laying the groundwork, I guess? And like, yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, I will say briefly with the women with an X, which I think I certainly pronounce basically women X,
Okay.
because it's close enough.
Yeah.
There's actually been discussion in the ultimate community, including the professional leagues, if that term even makes sense,
Mhm.
because does it group non-binary people into women light, quote unquote, which maybe you don't want to give that perception if you are trying to be full inclusive. So that's currently a project that
Mm.
I know that the board of the Western Ultimate League, and I know that the Premier Ultimate League, since you talked with one of those folks a few weeks ago, I know that we're all thinking about what does it look like for our leagues to be fully inclusive of trans and non-binary athletes, and that may include using Women X, and that may mean moving away from it and
Mm.
having some other way of defining who is included in these leagues. As for why Ultimate has been one of the most progressive sports, I think it's because it's relatively small and has a pretty open and progressive base of players. Ultimate, largely historically, people have found it through college. And so that sort of limits your demographics in terms of who's playing and who your population is, which
Mm.
has caused problems down the line because Ultimate is a predominantly white sport, which we are currently reckoning with, um, especially given the events of last year,
Mm.
the last 6 months. Um, but I think partially because of that, like when I wrote my article in 2017, um, I didn't realize that that people at USA Ultimate, the organization that I was trying to reach, would read it and would be like, wow, we have to start thinking about this. I didn't realize that the biggest names in the game would see it and think about it, and would start those conversations. It's the access that I've been able to have where I can directly reach people who are making the decision, say, hey,
Mm.
we should do things differently. And the platform that I was able to have via this online Ultimate Frisbee magazine, where I was publishing articles and my thoughts. I haven't published there recently, but for a couple of years, I was putting something out every 4 to 6 months, um, and just sort of putting thoughts out there for folks to think about, and for policies to pushing for policies to change and update. And without that access, without people publicly being able to see and hear it and reckon with it, I feel like it would be a very different story.
Mm.
And I feel like you can see it similarly in some other newer sports, like Quidditch, who have this really cool Title 9 3/4 policy that's also a gender inclusion policy. Which again, I think they're newer, younger, trying to think about, okay, how do we build these sports? How do we build these leagues from the ground up in an inclusive way
Mm.
for trans and non-binary athletes? We're not trying to redo something that has been done in the past. We're trying to make something new. And that's hard, but it's very exciting because you can set the precedent and you can make change relatively quickly, with younger sports, with sports where you can have more access to the people who are actually making decisions.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's true. That's very true. The access and the yeah, getting to the people who make decisions so much easier. That makes sense. And maybe to the I don't know, as like as far as my own experience of ultimate frisbee, we played that in high school and it was anyone come out and play. It doesn't matter, so maybe there's some of that too. But yeah, I'm curious then too. The second part that I wanted to ask from what you said earlier, you mentioned the hormones and the policies about hormones. So I'd love, if you don't mind, to walk through what are policies that are against, or like what does need to change in order for a league to be open and inclusive, and like those arguments on the scientific level, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, hormones are a whole complicated thing, that people try to rely on, as sort of the go-to thing when determining, especially people who like to go to testosterone, as that is the thing that makes you either really athletic or not very athletic. Um, and that actually doesn't check out. There's plenty of overlap between the athleticism of men and women. There's such variety in people's bodies and testosterone levels that you can't draw a clear comparison. However, because people end up trying to divide things by gender, then people end up going back to hormones, and to trying to determine it that way. So people go to hormones as the thing to determine. They go to testosterone as the marker of gender. And so, in trying to regulate gender divisions, men's and women's divisions, they go to testosterone levels. And generally speaking, when we're talking about trans and non binary inclusion, the sort of model, quote unquote, model is that a year on testosterone blockers is enough to see significant enough changes to make transgender women competitively not lose their quote unquote competitive advantage from being assigned male at birth and potentially going through male puberty. Pretty quickly breaks down because everyone is different. Everybody's
Mm-hmm.
bodies react to hormones differently. It's not that at day 364 I had a clear significant competitive advantage and then day 365 I didn't. um, it's a process. It's over time. Different people have different reactions and responses, and it's not a cut and dry thing. Um, and there are plenty of cisgender women or non-trans women, who are very athletic and who would beat many cisgender men anyway. So the
Mm-hmm.
assumption that there has to be this testosterone acts as this magic thing, um, doesn't really make any sense. And it goes the other way too for a lot of these policies, and a lot of them are based off of the NCAA policy, and at least USA Ultimates was, or the International Olympic Committee's policy, which looks at specific blood levels of testosterone as a measure that if you're under a certain value, then you lose your quote unquote competitive advantage. Um, And so then you're trying to regulate it based on access to hormones, based on this unknown thing. And for, as I was saying, for transgender men, for transmasculine people, um, the old USA Ultimate policy, and the NCAA's policy, from my understanding, is as soon as a trans man or transmasc person takes their first dose, their first shot of testosterone, they are no longer eligible immediately from women's divisions. Testosterone doesn't work that fast. It's, again, not that you take one dose of testosterone and all of a sudden you're this big hulking trans dude. It's a process. It's different.
Mm.
And the idea that either you have to wait a year for trans women to be eligible, or that people are immediately ineligible. So when we're talking about hormones, it makes no sense to have these cut and dry rules, to have hard and fast ideas of what makes someone competitively eligible and what gives them a competitive advantage and what doesn't. And so that's what's really, I think, encouraging about the USA Ultimate policy, moving away from the hormone requirements, is that they're recognizing it's complicated, and we don't want to determine what division someone can play in or how someone can participate and access our sport just because they may be accessing hormones in different ways. Access to hormones is also related to money. It costs
Mm.
money to get hormones, and that's also a socioeconomic access question as well. This is all, I wouldn't say it's all partially, it was at least partially kicked off by a non-binary person who was uh, wanting to start a low dose of testosterone, which sort of falls in between. There's an assumption in those hormone policies that you're either transitioning all the way one way or all the way the other way, and doesn't leave room for non-binary people who might be like, I'm going to take a really low dose of testosterone, or I'm not going to do it the entire time, in which case, how do you determine whether they're quote unquote fair to play in the quote unquote protected division of the women's division? Um, so it gets really complicated. And that's a problem, which is why I'm hopeful that leagues and organizations will try to move towards a model of inclusivity versus a model of exclusivity with hormones.
Mm.
But it's slow progress.
Well, and I feel like this is all bringing up, Castor Semenya, and how just her body is naturally filled with
Well,
more
but
testosterone.
that gets even complicated too, because in arguments about whether Castor should be able to compete, there might be arguments made that she was born a woman, quote unquote, born a woman, right, by the people, assigned female at birth. Therefore, she's good to run in the women's division. But then what happens to trans women who are not assigned female at birth? Then you're effectively pitting people with potentially intersex characteristics against trans people, which we want everyone to be able to compete. We don't want that comparison.
Right.
And and the thing around hormones too is it's not like these people don't know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. They know
Mm.
exactly. There's not very much research out there, but there's some idea of we want to really protect, quote unquote, protect women's sports, keep it, quote unquote, competitively fair, even though that may not make a lot of sense. And so they regulate it very specifically. And in IOC, it might not have been the IOC directly, but in a ruling related to Castor's eligibility to compete, there was an acknowledgement that yes, this is discriminatory, but it is necessary. And the fact that a governing body says, yes, we are discriminating, but we must discriminate in order to do something makes no sense.
No sense.
So,
You're right.
so this is a thing where we're talking about transgender athletes and my experience as a transgender woman, but we're also talking about non-binary athletes, which is not an identity I have personally, but fits very much along the same line of issues. And now we're talking about intersex athletes. And we can go down a whole rabbit hole of talking about the policing of Black and brown
Mm.
bodies in athletics. Would Castor have come under as much scrutiny as she did if she wasn't from a Black woman from South Africa?
Mm.
Dudi Chand is another example. If she wasn't a brown woman from India, would she have been under as much scrutiny? I don't know. And this is the complexity of talking about these aspects, is they're all intertwined. It's all intersectional, to use that buzzword. And we have to think broadly about this. We can't be limited in how we think about what women's sports look like.
Well, and this isn't your experience, so I'm not sure, but um, it does sound like there's this effort to protect women's sports, as you said. Is there any on the flip side of like, oh, you don't have enough testosterone, so you can't compete as a male? And
No,
in
it's the idea of the patriarchy. It's the idea
Mm,
that men are inherently better. And so my cynical take, but I think it's a true take, is that anyone who's associated with femininity at all is considered less than.
mm,
If we think about sports, right? Men's sports aren't worried about trans men coming in and dominating, right? But people are worried about trans women because there's an association with maleness there
mm,
inherently by being assigned male at birth. They're not worried about trans men because they were assigned female at birth, therefore must be weaker, must be less good. And there's not worries that trans men will dominate their sports. But the only person who's actually made it to a national team level is Chris Mosher, a transgender man. So the idea that trans women are the threat makes no sense. The idea that trans men aren't a threat and that their assigned female at birthness should disqualify them from being able to be very successful in sports, as Chris has shown time and again that he is incredibly good at his sports. So it the logic
mm.
quickly falls apart if you stare at it for long enough. The problem is people don't tend to think about it for long enough and move away from the stereotypes and assumptions that we have um, in order to get there. Like I play ultimate frisbee. I get my butt kicked by cisgender women when we could play ultimate all the time. I am transgender women haven't dominated ultimate since we've been able to come out. The inclusivity policy hasn't made it so that all of a sudden cisgender women are struggling to make teams of transgender women. There aren't even enough of us, let alone enough of us in one place to make that happen. And it's really about, if you think about these discussions, if you have the conversations, it starts to make a lot more sense to be more inclusive rather than to be more exclusive. And I think that's really what happened in Ultimate.
Mm.
I and then others brought up the question, what do we do? How are we being inclusive? And people started thinking about it and we're like, okay, well, we say we're inclusive, but are we?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I know that I think the NWSL, the soccer league, has now had their first transgender athlete come out.
Yep.
What do you think? What do you feel the movement is in other sports? Do you have a temperature on other bodies that are trying to move this forward? Is there hopefully a push for
It's
inclusivity, or
it's
still?
complicated.
Yeah,
Um,
big question. I
steps
know.
forward, but steps forward and steps backwards. While Ultimate is instituting this policy, USA Ultimate is instituting this policy of we are going to not have any hormone requirements whatsoever. USA Powerlifting has banned transgender athletes from competing in different divisions, and they have now, apparently, from my understanding, tried to create a third division to be like, look, trans athletes can compete, they just can't compete with any other athletes,
Hmm.
which is exclusive, especially when you think about that they already banned trans athletes before they made this third division, which presumably was made to try to cover their butts.
Wow.
Um, so it steps forward and step backwards. A lot of organizations don't even have policies in the first place, which means that there just need to be conversations had in those sports. But often the conversations are driven by trans folks, and without trans folks willing to step up, because it can be vulnerable, it can be hard to have these conversations and put yourself in the spotlight because there almost inevitably will be backlash,
Hmm.
then it's going to be tough to get movement in organizations. The reason why Ultimate has moved is because I and others have pushed it forward. The reason why other sports may not have moved so far is that transgender athletes may not have come out yet, may not feel like they can come out yet, or their organizing bodies are too big in order to be accessible for transgender athletes to have their voices heard.
Hmm. Gosh, yeah. And we hope that we are building communities that welcome inclusivity. I mean, uh, I do want to hear quickly, just, what was your reception in the ultimate world, and how important has it been to have inclusive community?
Yeah, Ultimate's generally been really great to me. I wonder sometimes how history would have changed had the reception been poor
Mm,
to the article in the first place. Probably very different. But yeah, the Ultimate community has been very welcoming and accepting. I, through my writing and speaking, have gained a bit of minor Ultimate celebrity, which is kind of strange. Um, because normally that's reserved for some of the best players in the country. And I, as someone who I was in Reno, Nevada, which is not a hub of ultimate frisbee, for much of the time of my writing and speaking. It's the idea that me, of all people, could have some ultimate celebrity was rather silly, but because I was speaking up, because I was accepted by the community, that's what gave me that privilege. So yeah, it's generally been great. Ultimate has a lot of issues still that we're grappling with, but at least on this front, I've been
mm.
very, very pleased with the progress that's been made in such a short period of time.
That's awesome. That's really awesome. When I'd love, I mean, I know that you have done a TED Talk on this, which is amazing. We're definitely
Yeah,
putting all these links. We'll link some articles. We'll link the TED Talk into the show notes. But tell us a little bit about that. And it was on gender inclusivity in sport. So, is there anything that if you were to do it again? I think it's almost 2 years since you did the talk. Is there
it's yeah, almost 2 years now.
anything else you'd tack on
I mean,
this
there's
year if you were
there's
doing it?
there's always more. I actually, when I wrote it, USA Ultimate hadn't even updated their policy fully, and so I was debating whether I should use that as an example or the push for it because it had changed at that point. And now that's a whole different conversation. In the TEDx talk, I mentioned Quidditch and their very cool policy of Title IX three-quarters, and I might just talk about Ultimate only because now there's been a shift. Because
Mhm.
really the point was that there need to be conversations had in sports. There need to be some discussion around this and trying to figure out ways that make the most sense to better include trans and non-binary people in sports. And again, if I were giving it today, I'd probably just stick with Ultimate. Ultimate as an example of ways that an organization has shifted over time in a pretty radical way. Um, yeah, it was a whole process. I actually was selected through a student speaker competition because I was enrolled as a graduate student at the University of Nevada, Reno at the time. Um, and they put on a student speaker competition where you could submit a basically practice TEDx talk, give the practice TEDx talk if you were a finalist, and then be judged on it. And the winner would get a spot in the upcoming TEDx University of Nevada that would happen in February. The competition held in September. So I wrote up a sample TEDx talk, gave it, won the competition. Um, and then, yeah, it was a bunch of prep for the next few months, meetings with the organizing committee, different drafts. At one point, I threw out probably a quarter to a third of my script because it just was too much to try to fit into the 10 minutes that they wanted us to speak in. Um, and yeah, lots of practice. Probably in the month prior, I practiced the full thing through by memory at least once a day, if not
Wow.
more.
Wow.
So I had the whole thing down memorized. There aren't any notes up there. It's all by memory. There was even a hitch during the presentation, during my talk, in the technology. Um, and they say that because it is being recorded, you can pause and restart. But I was like, I'm just doing this in one fell swoop. I'm not stopping. And just what you see on YouTube or what you see on the TED.com site is all live, is one take, which is, again, in hindsight, pretty incredible that that ended up happening.
Oh yeah, super impressive. And the delivery is amazing. So yeah, definitely everyone should check it out. And I'd love for you to yeah, share with people where they can find you, follow you, if there are any more resources that you can share of just how all of us can be more inclusive, how we can continue to educate ourselves. Anything like that that you want to share, please share.
Yeah. So I'm generally most active on Twitter at Jenna Weiner, the number six. That's the easiest way to follow me that I will post the most on, although given current recent events, given this first week of January. It's been a little bit slower on the posting of. I mostly talk about trans issues and ultimate frisbee and or disc golf. So that's what I'm going to be talking about mostly, unless it's politics stuff that's been going on in the
Mm.
real world. I also am working part time with an organization called Athlete Ally. They have resources. They're a great organization to support, really pushing for LGBTQ inclusion in sports. And of course, any of the major LGBTQ organizations, the Human Rights Campaign, GLAAD, the Trevor Project, all of those are great organizations that have resources and information that people can learn. The final note, and this is something that will hopefully be coming out more soon. As was mentioned briefly earlier, I'm on a board of this new growing Western Ultimate League. It's a pro ultimate frisbee league based in the Western United States. And we're still figuring things out. We were supposed to start our season. Our first season was supposed to be 2020, and then COVID happened, and that didn't happen. So we spent the last year or so, and the current board of directors are thinking about ways that we can really set our league up to be successful and be equitable from when we actually get to play our first games, hopefully sometime later in 2021. So hopefully there'll be more movement there. Keep an eye out for the Western Ultimate League. We are trying to grow and do things differently in Ultimate and model what it might look like for a pro sports league to do things in a different way than maybe the traditional model. That along with the Premier Ultimate League, which again, you all have already talked to some folks from there. So encourage folks to check out the Western Ultimate League, Athlete Ally. Again, you can follow me on Twitter as well. I think those are all my main things.
Awesome. Yeah, and we'll definitely put the Western Ultimate links in the show notes as well. So definitely check them out, give them a follow. But thank you so much, Jenna, for coming on. I really appreciate it. I would love to have you back and dive more into detail if possible. But just
Yeah,
thanks for
there's
your
always
time.
more to talk about. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.